Wrestling Rebooked. Spoiler in ND. Putting wrestling into submission. Welcome to Wrestling Rebooked with Spoiler and ND. Rewriting your favorite angles the way we want to believe. Putting wrestling into submission. Finally, that time has come. We used to rely on Meltzer. Now we bang our own drum. Wrestling Rebooked. Spoiler in ND. Putting wrestling into submission. The Spot Monkey is here, shooting from the hip, back to break more, and ready to let rip. Spoiler is the host. Will his mic be ready to go? He loves a Mac Clinic, and we're ready to start the show. From Mania to Survivor Series, a wrestling podcast. Each match rebooked, fresh views are cast. Wrestling Rebooked. Spoiler in ND. Putting wrestling into submission. Our finger is on the pulse for all the latest news. What's going on with Vince? We don't really get his views. We love a docking review, old school to new. I think it's time to tap out. Hit the music. We're through. Wrestling Rebooked. Spoiler in ND. Putting wrestling into submission.
Episode 14, Wrestling Rebooked, putting wrestling into submission. And we're back with a packed episode today. Coming right up, we've got our WWE Elimination Chamber review, PPV, that's gone down just in the last week. And we're excited to catch up with Big Bryce, our special guest for today. He's a bit of an NXT geek, so I'll be looking forward to talking to him. And stick around for our doc-in review on Yokozuna, the WWE Icons documentary that's doing the rounds on the network. As ever, find us on Twitter and Instagram and subscribe on YouTube where all new content will be posted. My name is Spoiler, and joining me today, shooting from the hip, waiting to be released from his pod, the Spot Monkey. Andeve, how's it going?
Yeah, pretty good. Unless, of course, I can sneak out of that pod in a different way, like our mate AJ Styles. But I tell you, if I was in those elimination chambers, given the quality of them, I'd be desperate to get in the ring as well and chuck some moves about. Interesting.
Or you could be like Zayn, who tried, of course, to keep himself in the pod. Depending on how you view. All right, then, let's get into it, shall we? WWE Elimination Chamber, which, of course, went down just in this last week, 21st of February. Just a few statistics on the Elimination Chamber just to kick us off. So the first Elimination Chamber debuted in 2002 at the Survivor Series.
Yeah.
And since then, there have been 28 Elimination Chamber matches. That includes some ECW Elimination Chamber matches.
Yeah.
Want to hazard a guess at who has the most victories?
The most victories, Triple H?
Correct. Triple H with 4. Most appearances, there are 2 tied.
I'd have Triple H in the mix for most appearances. Maybe Kane. Jericho?
Jericho is 1. Randy Orton's the other.
Oh, of course, yeah.
With 5. Yeah. And 11 Elimination Chamber PPVs as a standalone PPV. So let's get to the 2021 version, shall we? We opened up with a number 1 contender match for the Universal title on the SmackDown side. I noted that this match started 16 minutes into the actual PPV recording.
Yeah. It's interesting, first of all, on that cage side seats do they used to anyway, after pay-per-views, the amount of time there was actually in-ring wrestling and the amount of time that's talk segments, entrances. I think Undertaker's entrance alone. So it's interesting, that's 60 minutes. I was quite happy to skip through all those, to be honest, especially with no crowd, right? Who cares? You just want to see them in the ring. I thought this was an excellent match. I was really, really invested in it and I really, really enjoyed it. So I'm speaking really, really highly about this match in particular.
Okay. Bold start.
Yeah. Unusual. Normally it's all tears.
Okay, so Elimination Chamber first match was Sami Zayn, Kevin Owens, King Corbin, Jey Uso, Daniel Bryan, and Cesaro.
Yeah.
So definitely a packed ring to kick us off. 34 minutes and 20 seconds. So quite a long match as well.
Yep.
What were your highlights?
So breaking the match down thematically, perhaps, I actually, first of all, thought there was just the feature of this in a nutshell was there was so much good booking in this match, so much good booking. Even as they were hitting the ring, and I was skipping through the entrances, but the roles they were playing in terms of Sami Zayn talking about, oh, what am I even doing in here? They're going to screw me over. It's a conspiracy. Play off between him and Owens as they got in the ring, sort of shouting at each other. Uso and Owens as well. It just the start of the match, they were clearly in their roles, and the interplay between them, it's just a little bit more thoughtful than you sometimes see. It didn't feel like they really thought about who they were as they were coming to the ring in their characters. So I really enjoyed the roles they played. And then I thought the quality of the wrestling was really very good. Now, I know it wasn't a Matt Classic. I know it wasn't a one-on-one with a few headlocks and things, but it was a moment in the match where I sort of stepped back. I was sat down, so I probably just leaned back. But in the ring, lying down after a fantastic sequence or series of sequences and series of moves was Cesaro, Daniel Bryan, Kevin Owens, and Sami Zayn. And if you can't get excited about seeing those four in a ring together doing some good stuff, then either Vince has totally subverted what wrestling is about to destroy those people, or you just don't enjoy wrestling, in my mind, which is a bold statement. But the way they got to the four of them lying down, and I've seen a photo of it since, I just thought was absolutely superb. Probably three other things I'd add, if anyone is still awake. I thought the use of the chamber was very good. So we've talked before, and Adam Cole versus Velveteen Dream springs to mind when they had that match in the car park where they forgot about the ring and the wrestling and they just started hitting each other with mailboxes and letterboxes and doors and stuff. What they did here was they used the ring first and foremost. You know, you had Cesaro and Bryan starting, call back to what they've been doing on SmackDown. Again, good booking storyline. They used the ring very well, and then they just amalgamated the Elimination Chamber as a structure into it. So the spot where Cesaro was sort of hanging and doing chin-ups, really, really good, didn't feel too forced. Eventually we got to Uso having to do a frog splash off the top of a chamber because he'd done a couple off the ring, so it needed to elevate that bit further for the exit. So I really liked the way that they wrestled and then pulled in the Elimination Chamber. Likewise, you've got Owens had his arm trapped in the door. So there's a bit of innovation there that we haven't seen before. You referenced however many there's been now, 28. And then last two things here, and I'll take a breath. I thought the fluency of the match was good. You know, opening with Bryan and Cesaro. Then in comes Corbin. I don't like Corbin that much, but change it up a bit. Then in comes Zayn and Owens and Uso. It gets personal. You know, really nice fluency as they move through the match. And finally, I can't really remember a match where I was as invested in the outcome. You said there it was number one contender. I thought it was for number one contender at WrestleMania. So when Cesaro was eliminated, I actually let out, oh no, because I really wanted him to actually be in the main event at WrestleMania. So in sum, I thought the roles the characters were playing were excellent. They committed to them. The wrestling quality and the fluency of their match was really good. The way they used the chamber and the innovation was good. And I cared about the outcomes. It's still there.
Have you got a glass of water there? I don't know if you want to have a it's a rarity, but I really, really enjoyed that match. No, it's good to hear the enthusiasm, and just to put a couple of exclamation points on some of the detail that you've listed there. Sadly, I'm going to have to agree with most of what you're saying.
Fantastic. You spot monkey.
This match was much better than the match that came thereafter it, the Elimination Chamber match that came after it in the main event. And the reasons are firstly, you are opening up with Daniel Bryan and Cesaro. So not only have you got two technically absolutely sound wrestlers, but they actually used the ring for the first 7 or 8 minutes. And as you pointed out, if you don't enjoy Bryan and Cesaro in a ring, then are you into wrestling? the spots that they did use on the chamber were timed well, in some cases innovative, and sporadic. So again, to come back to your reference to Cole and Dream and other big, I'm thinking more as well the TLC matches where you are just table shot after table shot, chair after chair. Here, they use the chamber quite strategically. So when there was a big spot, you remembered it and you acknowledged it, and it was sold as such. I, like you, am not massive on Corbin, but he looked good here. They made him look good. Brian bumped and sold for him, and it made sense for him to go out early. Mm-hmm. There was a nice reference, which actually had totally passed me by, the fact that you had Zayn and Owens, of course, with so much history in the same match. And there was a nice creative moment where those two came together. Zayn, the smarmy heel, trying to get Owens on side. So that was good, and a nice reference back to their history. But the way the match sort of built to a crescendo, it came up nicely up the hill. And I, like you, was popping for Cesaro, and it got down to the final three. I wanted Cesaro to win, like that opportunity, someone new, fresh matches, etc., etc. So the build up to it was absolutely fantastic. And even though it was Brian that won, amazing. Just to see him get the acknowledgement and credibility that, of course, he deserves. What came after that is probably a different conversation. Maybe just tying the bow there on the Elimination Chamber match. I think it just made sense. The way that they were in there, what they were doing in there, how they were using the structure, how they were using one another. And I do wonder if that's because with 6 people involved, actually they just had to get down and talk about it and sort of work through it themselves. Whereas maybe in a 1-to-1 match, it's easier for Vince or whoever's messing up the booking, just say, right, you do this, this, and this. I don't want to see anything off the top rope. Hit someone with a chair and that's it. Whereas with the 6 of them, because it's more convoluted and complex, maybe they had to sit down and they took control. And I know Brian is involved in booking on SmackDown, and that's really been an excellent show of late. So I think ultimately for me, that chamber, everything we've just sort of bounced off each other there, like Uso bouncing off the top of that that pod, it just worked because it made sense. I, however, disagree if you think that the Reigns Bryan stuff wasn't good, because I also enjoyed that. Maybe it's because it caught me by surprise. I was expecting a number 1 contenders match for WrestleMania, so I've obviously missed something on SmackDown there because I'm on fast forward or whatever. But when it came out for a match, I was either going to have a match now. Cool. I mean, what you didn't think it was very good, or you didn't want to see it then? What? Well, in the first instance, I was a little bit disappointed that the match with Reigns came immediately after the chamber. It would have been nice for the PPV to have that match to come later in the show. I quite like that when you open up with a match with some degree of jeopardy for the same show. And then you have that kind of, you can run the angle, can't you, of Brian prepping backstage or whatever, trying to recover, to build to what I thought was going to be a Reigns Bryan main event. Obviously, it didn't go out that way. And in actual fact, if you watch the following SmackDown that's just aired in the last couple of days, then they're now running that angle of, you could only beat me having just gone through the Elimination Chamber, beat me fresh, which is now basically the angle that's going to be played out.
That doesn't work for you as an angle. I mean, I think because for me,
it's fine, but I mean, but of course we're in an age where we're constantly selling for the next thing in the next show. We're never living for the actual moment. And for the sake of that show, it would have been good if they had just dragged it out a bit more.
I see. I mean, fair enough. Again, maybe it's because it caught me slightly unaware. I was, here we go. And I thought, when he knocks him into that lock at the beginning, you're thinking, hold on, is he going to get something here? I mean, he didn't really believe it, but it does. It is in keeping with Reigns' character that he would come out then, head of the tables, this sort of aloof heel, I will fight now. So I was fine with it. We just had a 35-minute match, did you say? So actually a sort of short, quick blow off that doesn't bury the next match works for me. And we talked about whether Edge should be main eventing WrestleMania. But that aside, that was quite a good way for him to announce himself. And we talk about living for the moment rather than the next. At least that wasn't advertised as on Raw, Edge will tell you or whatever. Here he's just turned up, hit the spear, and we know where it's going. So that pace there after a long match worked for me.
Yeah, look, so Reigns and Bryan was a 1 minute 32 match. And actually, in fact, that hope spot at the beginning where Bryan had Reigns down, can you just imagine if there was a crowd there?
Yeah.
That would have got such a pop. And the fact that Reigns won the way he did obviously keeps the heat on Reigns, even though it buries Bryan. Mm-hmm. So I was kind of conflicted on that. What I didn't really like, I get what you're saying about Edge, but I thought it was just a little bit contrived, the way he hit the spear, then all this pyro just goes off randomly, and he points to the sign in a really kind of awkward way. He just sort of kind of angles at it. That sign pointing thing starting to get on my nerves.
Oh yeah, Rousey did it worse, didn't she? When she turned up at the end of a Royal Rumble and pointed it, and she wasn't even in it.
Yeah.
So just Twitter like.
So Edge points at it once and then kind of looks away and then points at it again because he's just remembered that someone backstage told him to point at the sign. I don't know. It just felt a little bit contrived for me. But nevertheless, certainly be pumped to see Reigns and Edge if indeed it goes that way at Mania.
Yeah. I think it will be. I mean, Vince's motto is never advertise a match you're not going to see. I mean, they're pretty heavily advertising this, so I'm assuming that we're expecting Reigns to beat Bryan. But also, if that match means we get another Reigns-Bryan match further down the road, I mean, that's pretty good. They had a good match a couple of years back. Reigns now very clearly in heel mode. Bryan will make him look good. I've got, after 2 matches on this pay-per-view, I was thinking this is fantastic. This is the best wrestling show I've seen, certainly since SummerSlam, maybe including SummerSlam. And then if you take out SummerSlam, you're going back to an NXT last year, really, or the ones they've had this year.
Bold statement. Are you rebooking?
No, I thought the Elimination Chamber itself was excellent. When the door was open, I would have liked them to maybe, no one's done it, I don't think, in the Elimination Chamber, go outside and do a little bit around it. They could have done that. But if there's no crowd, who's going to bump off the top apart from maybe Jeff Hardy? So no, I'd keep it as it was. No, would you rebook?
I love Cesaro going over, which of course changes the total direction. But yeah, other than that, we'll keep the same. All right, next up, we had Riddle versus Bobby Lashley versus John Morrison for the US title match. A triple threat. Side note there, of course, that there was a fatal 4-way in the kickoff show to determine who was going to be the third person after Keith Lee was ruled out injured. But anyway, the US title match was 8 minutes and 40 seconds. Of course, Riddle winning the title, Andeve.
Yeah, this was good for me as well. Maybe it's one of those things. Once you're, it's a snowball effect. Once you're on the roll of enjoying yourself, then you're more invested and you're more happy to let a few things slide. But I thought this was really good. I thought Lashley looked incredibly. I didn't realize it was only 8 minutes, but incredibly dominant early on when he was sort of suplexing Riddle and Morrison and smashing them around outside the ring. I thought that looked really good. And then he sort of exits stage left for a little bit. And I liked the switch up when it was Riddle and Morrison. I think they could have a really good series of matches together. Morrison has been massively, massively underutilized since he's come back. They both missed then sort of a couple of high risk moves on Lashley. So again, we're protecting Lashley. And at the time, maybe it wasn't obvious, but it certainly has become obvious since. So Lashley is getting protected. You're thinking, okay, but he's probably going to lose the title here. And the title does come off him, but he's not pinned. He's nowhere to be seen. He's not looked weak. He's thrown them both around. They've sold for him. They've done a good bit of shtick 1-to-1. Again, I thought this was sensible, like worked. If I was rebooking, 8 minutes is probably a bit short. Let's give him a little bit longer, twice that length. But for me, that was another good match. Well conceived match.
I was just pleased to see Snickers back as a sponsor. Yeah, look, it was all right. At first, I was a little bit baffled as to why this is a triple threat in the first place and why Morrison was in this match. The build-up on Raw has been all about Riddle and Lashley / Hurt Business. And suddenly there's Morrison in a triple threat. So that threw me off somewhat. But despite saying that, I'm with you on some of the exchanges between Morrison and Riddle. Riddle's, I don't like his gimmick at all. And he seems like a bit of an idiot outside of the ring. But his in-ring work for his German suplex, like his Broton, as he calls it, and his exclamation points on the way he delivers those moves, absolutely just you can watch over and over. Just really, really good. I know you said about protecting Bobby Lashley, but I mean, if you want to protect him, just I suppose don't take the title off him. But despite that, it was a bit of a shame that he lost the title. But for what came later in the show,
yeah, he's got to lose the title though because of what's going later.
Right? Yeah.
I think actually looking back at that, they could have done more with him as the US champion. Just made him look, especially with the way they're obviously now booking or seem to be booking. They could have had him just stand almost like a Raw challenge, the US challenge that Cena used to do, but from a heel point of view, no one can beat me. Who wants to come out? And just have him running gauntlets because he was made to look strong over Riddle and Morrison, but I haven't really seen him do much with that title recently. I know he's putting people in the Lashley lock and stuff. But yeah, pretty good match. I agree with you about Matt Riddle. There's absolutely no question about the quality of his in-ring work, but there's something irritating about that gimmick. And it might just be because it's the bro. Everything's got to be bro mission, bro lock, final bro, Broton, bro when he comes out. He's the original bro. Like, I get it. You know, like, it's all good to have a gimmick and stuff, but we don't need to hear it every 30 seconds. But I mean, again, for the match, I'd make it longer, like I said. But other than that, you want to get the title off Lashley because you want to elevate him. That's the way to do it. And you've given Morrison and Riddle a little bit of time to show that there's more to come from them. I guess the other thing I would say is that just, again, how badly Morrison's been booked, because clearly those two could have a great match. Morrison has just ended up in stupid feuds with The Miz, alongside The Miz.
Get to The Miz in a bit, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, it's just been, if nothing else comes out of that and those two start being a bit more serious, then we'll take it. But hey, I'm jumping ahead here. Next up, we had the women's tag title match. Contain your excitement. We had Nia Jax and Shayna Basler against Bianca Belaire and Sasha Banks. Right, I'll kick us off here. This was just an absolute mess. In the first instance, I'm slightly at a loss as to why WWE Creative are insistent on putting their women's champions with a partner in the tag team title scene. It's not like they're short of talent on the card, either side of Raw or SmackDown. It's not like they're really elevating anyone, and it's not like they have good matches. Add to the fact you've just had a Dusty Cup Classic on NXT where you've got two winners or two girls that have won that tournament and are coming off a bit of a streak. They're advertised to have a women's tag match. Why not have them have it here? I get that it's probably scheduled for somewhere else, somewhere down the line, but this was the opportunity, fresh off the back of that, to have them in. And then that's before you get to Nia Jax in the ring. Your thoughts?
I thought this was absolutely terrible. This match was absolutely terrible. I agree. On the booking point of view, it's a bit too. It's identical to what's happening on Raw, where you've got the challengers teamed up together in the tag match. It doesn't really make any sense, and it doesn't do anyone any good because you can only lose because either you're going to make your tag team champions look weak because they're going to lose the title, and then they're going to go on to individual stars who are going to lose them because they're individual stars, or your individual stars look weak because they're losing to the tag team champions. So the premise, I agree, is really poor to start with, but the match itself was absolutely terrible. So talk about Nia Jax. She's essentially a monster heel, right? She's the equivalent of Strowman in terms of, the size on the women's roster. So she's supposed to turn up, throw a few people around, look really dominant. And then when she gets knocked down, it's meant to be a big thing. But she actually in the ring looked terrible. There's a moment where she sort of fell into the rope and came back out. And she doesn't look strong and dominant. She sort of looks like she's drunk and lost her balance. Really, really poor. And unfortunately, I thought Basler was also really poor in this match. Like she was, her sort of sell in terms, or her tell in terms of the moves was so obvious. So there's one where Bellaire came off the ropes, and a second time when Banks came off the ropes, and both times Basler is absolutely giving away that she sees them coming and she's about to move it, turn it into a counter or a move, whatever. I thought she was really, really poor. And then there was a moment on the apron where Basler went sort of into a move with Bellaire, and it just looked so obvious the way they were scripting it. And of course, it doesn't have to be super fluent as though they're dance partners, but it needs to look in some way like there's a flow to a move, and it just looked like they were rehearsing rather than delivering it. So I thought that really, really poor. And that's the second match in a row for Banks. The last one was with Carmella, was it, on the last pay-per-view? Lacey Evans, perhaps, where she looked absolutely terrible in that match as well. And this is Banks, who's done an amazing load of work with Bayley, become the champion, is at the pinnacle, and yet she's having, and it's partly her fault, but she's also been put in this situation, these awful matches. So I just thought the whole match was poor and weak, and that's before you get to Reginald. I don't know what he's doing there. What is he doing there? He's neither of their valets. It's a rubbish match, but I was 3-0 at that point in good matches, so whatever.
Started off so well, didn't it? And then we've just sort of come crashing down. I think there's probably a few points to pick up on here. Firstly, Nia Jax. The problem, we've talked about before about her skills in ring, and it, such as the way the business is now and its level of exposure, she's in danger of becoming complete caricature and complete joke person. Because there's a lot of the IWC, Internet Wrestling Community, now tuning in for Nia Jax just to watch the next botch, or just to watch the next, comedy, it's all the stuff with My Hole. So, as you say, they're presenting her as this monster heel, but yet all that's happening is just like goofy, stupid stuff. So that's the first problem. Shayna Basler, she's not exactly got a great deal as she's having to work hard just to keep herself over, working with Jax. On the subject of Sasha Banks, a lot of what you're talking about there extends into SmackDown as well. One thing that really jumped off the page watching this week's SmackDown after this match was Reginald coming out again, eventually Bianca Belair declaring that she's going to fight Sasha Banks. And then the two of them just look at each other and smile and point at the sign. There's no beat down. There's no angle. They literally just smile at each other and point at the sign. And they're stood next to each other in the ring. Like, you're supposed to be fighting. There's no animosity or anything. I agree with you. Banks hasn't been great over the last couple of months. I think she's been booked into a tough corner. She did carry this tag match. What is Reginald still doing there floating around? There's no Carmella. She's nowhere to be seen, but Reginald's still coming out with a glass of champagne. Maybe she's drunk backstage, but I would just like that the purpose of this match in closing was surely to set up Bianca Belair and Sasha Banks at WrestleMania, and they just didn't do it.
No, they didn't do anything with this match. It wasn't like the two of them looked incredibly strong, and so you could continue their sort of busy mates for a little bit longer, and it wasn't like they looked like dissenting tag partners.
Yeah.
The whole match was just really, really off. And I'm not sure any of the individual performers contributed positively to the match. You say Pence carried it, but it just wasn't a very good match.
Yeah. How are you going to rebook it?
How am I going to rebook it? Well, you have to go back a long way. Either you're going to. I just don't think these two tag teams should exist in the first place.
Yes.
And then they shouldn't be fighting for the tag titles. And if you are going to do that and get to the point, we've got these tag teams, then the match needs to have something that is a good match, and then B, the match, there is a consequence of the match, and there wasn't a consequence really, and the match wasn't very good. So in which case it doesn't fit either criteria. So you just got to bin it off.
Okay. Let's get into the main event then, shall we? So The second Elimination Chamber match. This one was for the WWE title. Drew McIntyre, AJ Styles, Jeff Hardy, Kofi Kingston, Randy Orton, and Sheamus went 31 minutes and 10 seconds in the Elimination Chamber. Did you enjoy this one as much?
I did eventually. So I think this was another very well booked match. I think it was a very, very slow start. I don't know. And there's probably a few reasons for that. One is that Randy Orton is starting, so it's just going to be slow. I think the styles didn't mesh quite as well as the first Elimination Chamber. So to start with, I was thinking, nah, this is nowhere near as good. I also think another reason is that it's a gimmick pay-per-view and we've already seen this match. So we've just seen 6 people a couple of hours ago create a fantastic match. You now got to see the same people again. It's too much. Sorry, the same gimmick again with different people. It was too much of the same. So I was a bit fatigued from the gimmick. So to start with, I wasn't rating it, but by the end, I thought it was really good as well. What about you?
Similar line of thinking. My first issue is that we've got 2 Elimination Chamber matches on the card itself. So you're always going to be starting at a lower point, and you can't sort of dress it up with, oh, one's for the title, one's number 1 contender. Like the presentation is still the same. I thought some of McIntyre's work was interesting in this. It'll be interesting to see what direction he goes. He was quite heelish, which was something you picked up on, launching Hardy, who's obviously a big baby face.
Yeah.
And the sort of balance of heels and faces seemed a bit off to me. But nevertheless, as soon as AJ Styles came into the match, I think generally things picked up anyway. Quite enjoyed the angle with Omos ripping the door off. That was, different at least. Low points for me. There was a period of the match where we went through 3 or 4 different spots, which I literally called out loud as they were about to happen or before they happened. They were just completely predictable the way we saw Kofi do his big spot off the top of the cage. If you watch it back, you even see Sheamus and I think Styles looking up at him to see if he was ready to jump down. So you knew that was happening. You also have Kofi Kingston, what is he, 250 pounds, something like that, knocking over 4 guys of more than 300 pounds. Like, he just wouldn't knock them over. And then he gets eliminated. And then a couple of minutes later, Sheamus catches Kofi Kingston. So, Kofi just knocked him over. So it just looked a bit ridiculous. Ditto the Hardy elimination as well, just so predictable. Like, Drew McIntyre doesn't sell the Hardy swanton, and then he just gets pinned. And last point I'd make would be I wondered if you saw the Styles sort of slight wobble on the top of the rope.
It was for a Styles clash or something? He went back and did it almost immediately
again. Yeah, 450 splash.
Yeah, and then he sort of messed it up, and then he went back and
went
straight away for whatever reason. Yeah, I noticed that. Aside from that, though, you are right. He was the MVP of that match. The only thing doesn't quite make sense is, again, I like the innovation, the fact that he was going to enter but he just won a match on Raw to enter later, and then he decides to put himself in earlier. So that didn't quite make sense from a storyline point of view. But I thought he was the MVP in terms, eliminating Sheamus, and his the 450 splashes were pretty decent. I think here, partly because you'd already seen one, and partly because, like you say, the mix of styles wasn't quite so good. There was some good bits with Kingston, Styles and McIntyre where they were sort of exchanging suplexes, and then Sheamus comes in and him and McIntyre start smacking each other around a little bit. But it just didn't quite have the flow or the connection through the various phases of the match. There was also a moment which was really irritating where Corey Graves, I think, or maybe Michael Cole, probably Michael Cole, shouts "Twist of Fate" when Hardy's delivering a move, and what Hardy delivered was modified stunner. So rather than go flat as he does and lie on his back for the twist of fate, he ended up on his backside, dropping a sort of the second part of the stunner. And the commentators shouted twist of fate when it clearly wasn't. And then Hardy followed it up with a twist of fate and then shouted twist of fate again. You're like, come on, that's you need to be watching a little bit what's going on and not just reading your notes, which has been an issue anyway with me for the commentary. I do think it wasn't quite as good, but I didn't mind Hardy going off the top rope. You have to have some stuff. Kingston, it was good. I thought it was a good, well-built match. You know, Orton eliminating early was good, and by Kingston playing off their history there. Styles and McIntyre, I think the last two. That's the two you want at the end: the champion and the MVP of the chamber. So I still think it was pretty good. It just wasn't as good as the other Elimination Chamber, and then it's made worse because you've seen the other Elimination Chamber.
Yeah, that's a fair analysis. I can't disagree too much. How would you rebook it?
I think I'd take Orton out. It's just too slow to start with that for the main event, and you've got more people coming. I hadn't really thought about it, but I think you're right about the sort of face heel balance. Just didn't really work, especially with McIntyre almost playing heelish tactics. I think I just rebook it. I just get rid of gimmick pay-per-views. You've got an Elimination Chamber match. You don't need two on the show. Just do something different. Let's do something different with this. But of course, McIntyre ends up winning the title or retaining the title, and then that's not even the end of the show.
No, and just before we move on to that, I think my rebooking thoughts would be: let's not have this in the chamber. McIntyre and Sheamus have played out a semi-interesting storyline over the last few weeks. I thought they could have. This would have been an appropriate PPV to have their match, their one-on-one match. It could have gone that way, and that way you can easily keep the title on McIntyre. I think those two have pretty decent chemistry. But yeah, anyway, so as you were saying, that wasn't the end of the PPV, because officially, out comes Lashley and beats down McIntyre. In comes The Miz and cashes in his Money in the Bank contract, and officially beats Drew McIntyre in 31 seconds to win the title.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is a surprise or not. I'm actually really high on this. I thought this was really good. And that's probably why I think the Elimination Chamber match was quite good, because this is almost unlike the women's tag match, this is a consequence of the match. And so the match means something more than the sum of its parts. My only criticism here would be it was a little bit foreshadowed, like too much. So we've seen 2 segments of Miz backstage talking to people, and they also had on the graphic before all the people in the Elimination Chamber, and then Miz popped up as well with the briefcase. It was just, obviously there's 2 ways you can run things: totally out the blue so you never see it, or with the foreshadowing so you're waiting for it. But I think they obviously went with the foreshadowing, but I think they did that. It wasn't as effectively implemented as it should have been. That said, the reason I like it is not particularly because the title's on Miz and I'm desperate for it to be on Miz, although he's a good solid worker and he probably brings some different faces to the screen, to the product, but it just shakes things up so much. We were walking towards WrestleMania thinking it's going to be Sheamus McIntyre, not really interested. Have they got a decent fight for McIntyre? It's really obvious. And suddenly McIntyre's not even got the title. So, by the way, at this point, I didn't realize there's another pay-per-view before Mania, which I now do, but need to be checking my schedule more. But I thought it was really good because you've got the title on Miz. You've got Morrison around to sort of back him up. The only trouble is there, and this is rebooking, is they've been made a bit of a joke. If they were made a serious, you'd be like, well, how's anyone going to get the title off him? Because he's got Morrison backing him as well. So you've got those 2 there. Then you've got Lashley coming out, having lost the title, but still looking really strong. A rebooking, he should have been made to look even stronger in the run-up to this. But he's involved in the title picture somehow. And you've got McIntyre having lost the title, who's also just off Elimination Chamber, where he's had a match with Styles at the end, and Sheamus is in there as well. So for me, it just has really shaken the road to WrestleMania up. Obviously, Edge is declared. So I'm quite happy with it. I think it's really good.
Good. Yeah, like for me, when Lashley came out, I popped. One of the biggest pops of watching the whole PPV. I think if you go back in the last couple of episodes, I've been calling for Lashley to come up into this main event scene. So as well as being proved right, like I was excited to see that. Then for the Miz, I actually didn't watch any of those backstage segments. I was on the fast forwards,
Oh, right.
so I wasn't aware of what was going on. But on initial, I was like, oh no, we can't have the Miz as the title holder again. But actually, when you think it through, really McIntyre, you said about walking to WrestleMania. Really, we were like light strolling to WrestleMania, weren't we? Like there was no real sort of big build or big interest. And as
Not
much as
really
like
stale.
McIntyre, like it was just maybe that run was just a bit stale.
100% stale. No, I agree. I think it was. It was just too, again, it was just too obvious. Or there was a lack of opportunities where you're thinking at SmackDown, you're thinking Cesaro and Bryan, and obviously Edge is now in there, and Uso. Here you're looking at McIntyre thinking, do I want to see McIntyre Edge? Not really. I mean, obviously we're not going to see it. McIntyre Sheamus? Not really. Now you don't even know who's going to have the title. I don't think it will be the Miz. I'm not sure. But it just really moves things around a little bit.
Yeah, and suddenly we're excited for Mania. So they've done something right, we have to say, don't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Closing thoughts on Elimination Chamber?
I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it. No, I don't think that's quite true. I think over the last year, with the pandemic and then running into the pandemic, the WWE has lowered expectations of what a good pay-per-view is. It probably wasn't as good a watch as, say, the Takeover that happened the night before or the week before. I can't remember. But you've got a couple of good Elimination Chamber matches in there. One very good, one good. You've got some title changes, some storyline advancement, and you've only really got one negative in terms of the matches there. So I think that's a decent enough pay-per-view.
Yeah, fair. Look, I think if you're giving it an 8 out of 10, I'm probably giving it a 7. Like it was pretty good. It was pretty interesting, and it kept you engaged all the way. The storyline advances has to be one of the biggest things, right? When you look at it overall. So I think we have to say it is WrestleMania season. We expect things to pick up. Do we not?
You just hope so. Imagine if they don't. Oh.
Yeah. I just wish they would stop just rinsing the same gimmick over and over. But anyway, can't have it all. Time to move on?
Yep, no problem.
Episode 14, Wrestling Rebooked, putting wrestling to submission. All right, section 2, and time for our guest. We caught up with the one and only Big Bryce, NXT expert. So we will cut to that right now. Big Bryce, welcome to Wrestling Rebooked. How are we doing?
Doing very well, thank you very much. How about yourself?
All good, thank you. All good. Thank you for coming on.
More than welcome.
Let's get straight into it, shall we? Looking forward to chatting about NXT. Your bag.
My bag, yeah, absolutely. Big NXT fan. I reckon it's probably the best wrestling product on television at the moment that I'm into. I get that there's a big following for AEW at the moment, but I just can't get into it. So I think NXT is definitely the one for me.
Yeah, interesting. We haven't actually talked about NXT in a great deal. We sort of dodged around it a little bit, or we mainly focused on the main roster. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on where NXT is at the moment and where it's maybe headed in the future. So why don't you kick us off by telling us, like, what's the best thing about NXT? What do you enjoy?
So I reckon when you think about enjoying wrestling, I reckon it always sits on a bit of a sliding scale, somewhere between pro wrestling and sports entertainment, or even that larger extremes, wrestling as an amateur sport and slapstick comedy, I suppose, at the very end of the opposite part of the spectrum. But really, my enjoyment sits somewhere with a bit more wrestling and a fair bit of sports entertainment. I like a laugh. I like the big characters. I like the sketches and the vignettes. I love all of that stuff. But there needs to be like a solid foundation of quality wrestling, and that's exactly what NXT gives you. It gives you quality wrestling week in, week out, but definitely some stuff to laugh at, some over-the-top characters, and people who you can get behind and follow their stories over the course of a week or a month or a calendar year or something to that effect.
Do you have any examples of that? Like either matches or storylines, wrestlers that you enjoy?
I reckon, so if you look at that, the very pinnacle of what storytelling is at NXT, you go to the Ciampa and Gargano feud that runs over about 2 years. You know what I mean? It goes all the way back to the Cruiserweight Classic and caps itself off with just a pretty poor, to be honest, one final beat match, but some pretty good matches in between. But that spans over about 2 years of just this budding friendship, budding rivalry, budding friendship, budding rivalry, really big rivalry, absolute hatred. Okay, now we've blown it off. But that took so long. But by the end of it, you were so invested in both characters. And for about 6 months, Ciampa could walk out with no crowd music and just be absolutely hated because he'd just become such a despicable character. And that is a great aspect of the storytelling that NXT can do over a long period of time. And you kind of see that sort of coming through again in more recent stuff with Adam Cole turning on the rest of the UE. It's this character who now is going to go through like a huge character arc of being an absolute legend, a superstar, the guy that everybody loves, and is about to become the guy that everybody loves to hate. And that is what NXT does really, really well.
They're both excellent examples. I guess one thing to follow up on there is when you're talking about sports entertainment versus sort of wrestling and that continuum, how would you box up what wrestling is, say, in terms of what the WWE main roster offers? What would you say that is in terms of sports entertainment? And then how does that contrast with what you're looking for in what you've described there in terms of sort of the purer wrestling side of things?
So the main roster is almost entirely sports entertainment with a little bit of wrestling sprinkled in, especially when you're looking at weekly TV. So most of the main roster television, especially Raw, I think this lands specifically with Raw, less so on SmackDown, but Raw is just filling time. It's just interview after interview, then recap, then 2-minute match, then interview, then recap, then talk show segment, then Our Truth comes out, does a comedy sketch, gets chased around by about 15 jobbers, then 10-minute match, then recap, then main event, and then we're out. Not much wrestling happens over the course of 2 or 3 hours on Raw. But what you do have is a fair bit of sports entertainment, big characters, lots of great chat, really strong promo work. And that's why someone like The Miz, whether you like it or not, he can run in, take Drew McIntyre's belt and put on a good show for a week or two because he can do great promos for a couple of weeks without a shadow of a doubt. But we don't need to see him do a 450 splash or a moonsault because that's just not what Miz does. He's all chat, but very little wrestling. But he's also WWE champion, and there's your reason why.
And so conversely, when you're looking at NXT and that style, the more wrestling and less sports entertainment, what is it? How would you capture exactly what that wrestling sort of is or looks like in your mind?
So that wrestling is technical. It's really, really fast-paced, usually. It's quite stiff. It looks, I suppose, almost like independent wrestling. It's a bit crisper and it's a bit smoother. But more than anything, it's a technical display with pace, and in the odd like big character and a fair few high spots, big table breaks, a bit of hardcore elements and things like that. But it's a technical mat wrestling, really quick, really snappy sort of format. And that's really strong. I think that is what I would consider to be really entertaining wrestling, and almost the best way to get sports entertainment out of a wrestling format, because you can go, oh my God, because someone's just done like a backflip off of a ladder. That's perfect.
Where do you think your fans sit on that continuum? Like, because do you think there's more of an NXT base that will just watch NXT for the reasons you just said, and then on the main roster, people just want to see more of the showbiz?
I reckon there's a fair bit of NXT that is WWE loyalists who watch WWE because they've always watched WWE. They've always watched Raw, they've always watched SmackDown, they like the product, and NXT is an extension of that. And then there's another group of fans who probably don't watch Raw or SmackDown, but flip between watching NXT, maybe AEW, and they might click around on YouTube and watch whatever else they can get out there, especially if they're in North America where it's hard to get hold of maybe Japanese wrestling, but they like that style. They go out of their way to find it, but they can't get that, so they'll watch it on YouTube or wherever else you can find it on the internet. But they're sated by that need for that sort of technical finesse through watching NXT.
That makes sense. So, did you see the last takeover? I'll take that.
Yes,
yes.
I did. Of course, I did. Quality. I think it's at this stage now where NXT only really competes with itself as a pay-per-view format. I thought the last NXT was really strong and much stronger than the last 2 or 3. I think the Dusty Cup really helped bulk out the card and put 2 solid tag team matches in there, which were both really strong. I really enjoyed, and I'm really enjoying in general, women's wrestling at NXT level. And I thought that Dakota Kai and Raquel Gonzalez did a sterling job in making themselves like a really dynamic but quite different team, almost like getting off topic here, but a little bit like a little large duo that you'd get up front in old school football, like high pacing Dakota Kai, all power moves in Gonzalez. I thought that was quality.
That match really set the tone for that PPV, didn't it? They went out at 100 miles an hour. Dakota Kai bumped all over the place. And they went 20 minutes in a tag match, which often gets criticized, doesn't it? But yeah, I agree with you. I thought they looked fantastic coming out of that.
Yeah, definitely. I think they both looked really good coming out of it. They also look like credible number one contenders for the women's belt as well. So I look forward to that in a couple of weeks' time. And they definitely set a really good tone. Kishida and Gargano, to me, stole the show. That is, when you talk about the example of what is that type of wrestling, Gargano is absolutely like the mastermind of putting on a really good NXT wrestling match. It's fast, it's technical, it's counter after counter, but it's also like really larger life character work as well. And you know he's scrambling to hold onto his belt, which is really entertaining. And I always think that Gargano is a bit of a sort of a wrestling amplifier. No matter who he wrestles with, you're always going to get a good match. But if you put him with someone really good, they'll be even better. And that was evident in the Gargano Kishida match, which for me was my favourite match, swiftly followed by Balor and Dunn, which was a really actually quite a different wrestling match because it was much slower and stiffer, but it kind of got you a real sense of the characters and their relationship. You can tell the story going into it was Balor and Dunn really don't like each other, and you really got the sense of that in their match. And it's different to perhaps Balor and Roddy Strong, where it seems like a bit of a race to be the best, and you see that in the pace of the matches in the previous NXTs. Or the previous takeovers, where it's high spot, but it's lots of high knees, lots of jumping in, and the injuries as a consequence are solved because it's this sort of race to win, as opposed to a breaking you down slowly, methodically, in the way that Dunn and Balor try to do to each other.
And it's interesting that you're talking about Dunn and Balor match, and then Gargano and Kishida in his match as well, because they're all small guys. And if you're being sort of loose with the description, you'll be like, oh, it's all a bit kicks and flips. But actually, the thing they have in common is their size. But there's a big difference between a Balor Cole match, a Dunn Cole match, a Dunn Balor match, a Kyle O'Reilly Balor match. Like, okay, yes, they're all small and it's all kicks and flips down there, but actually, the way they put together the matches and sort of Gargano and Chuck in there with his different style, and that actually allows for a great diversity rather than just, you got a couple of big guys who can punch, but they can't, and throw someone around, but they can't do anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I suppose you could sometimes look at it and say it's all kicks and flips, but I don't see it that way. I see it as really highly athletic, but I see it as people really fleshing out their characters through their wrestling. And you don't have that on the main roster. You don't see what characters like for their wrestling. You kind of see it through their promo work, or you see it through their interview work. But down in NXT, you kind of see it in the ring. And that is why you can have these smaller guys do lots of different things together and have varying outcomes.
Just wanted to ask you, Big Bryce, what your thoughts were on Gargano as a heel. That's sort of that irritating heel with his crew. Do you like him in that role, or prefer him more as babyface?
I Gargano in that context is really good at the sports entertainment bit of it. It's really comedic, it's silly, it's goofy. But you know, when he gets in the ring, he can turn it on, even if he tries to avoid it at every cost. I prefer it. I prefer him as either I prefer him as a heel in general. I liked his work when he was a bit of a deluded heel around Ciampa and was being clearly manipulated. And I like him as now sort of an annoying heel that's usually the one taking the pin or taking the fall until it really, really matters when he turns it back on again. I just think it makes really entertaining television. But I think that's also my preference for heels in general. I don't think WWE at any level really presents baby faces really well. It's really hard to get behind them. So I prefer Gargano as a heel, but I think that's because I prefer heels in WWE generally across the board. Maybe that's not really fair on Gargano, to be honest.
Kind of feeds into our next question, though, and looking at the difference between our NXT stars and those on the main roster, and why there is a difference in modern day WWE.
Yeah, I think that's kind of largely based upon sort of what the purpose of the main roster is and what the purpose of NXT is. You kind of look at as I understood it, the aim of NXT was to develop stars for the main roster, to teach them how to do television, how to do promos, how to work with a hard camera, and things they might have not done on the independent circuit, or if they're completely new to wrestling, they wouldn't have done at all. And then they're polished off at in NXT, they make their way up to the main roster. And the main roster is kind of the finished article, but it's not really become that. It's kind of become a place where it's sort of an independent wrestling product through the WWE guys. So they don't tend to actually do the things you need to do to be successful on the main roster. They don't tend to do heavy promo work. The promos are much shorter. They do a lot of wrestling. They do much longer matches. Even on television, their matches tend to go longer than the average matches on Raw or SmackDown. So the main difference is they flipped the same way. That whole spectrum of pro wrestling versus sports entertainment, they flip the ratio on its head again. So it's almost a completely different product. And it's a product that works for me, but I don't think it's a product that works as a developmental program moving forward or for the last few years. And you can see that through all the wrestlers that have gone up. Some of your favorite wrestlers as well. You think of Ricochet and Aleister Black. They were absolute stars in NXT. And I have no idea where Aleister Black is. I don't even know what roster he's on. And Ricochet just gets whipped relentlessly week in and week out because they don't know what to do with him up there.
So are you linking back to what you were saying earlier about, let's go look at a football comparison. It's almost like NXT is supposed to be the youth team preparing them for the main team, but then they get to the main team and they're almost playing not just a different style, but almost like a different sport entirely. So it's like, this is our developmental, let's get them ready for the main roster. They then get up to the main roster and you're like, no, we don't do what you've just been learning to do. Forget all that. It's something different. Is that what you're sort of suggesting?
Yeah, absolutely. They're taught in NXT to go out and have storming 35-minute matches at NXT takeovers. And you'd imagine that when everybody else is in the performance center watching a takeover, that's the thing to aspire to, right? The thing to aspire to these quality wrestling matches that are getting rave reviews by Dave Meltzer and by critics and fans alike. But they'll go up eventually to the main roster, and that will almost definitely never happen. That will never be part of their sort of professional experience on the main roster. So it's kind of, they get up for the entirely wrong style of performance.
I suppose Vince is the main reason for that. But I mean, you could argue on the flip side that they've got to learn the business, right? They've got to learn how to cut the promo, how to get it into a specific time frame, how to hold a 20, 25-minute match, and how to get themselves over, right? That's the premise of wrestling. So if they're not doing that in NXT, or indeed just coming into NXT and just going out and chasing down our truth, then like, what are they learning as what are mostly sort of young, up and coming stars?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a lot of a lot of the main roster is filling time because Raw is so long. It's 3 hours long. It's a lot of television to fill. So Vince, I would imagine, wants someone who can go out there and fill a segment of time, can fill 15 minutes. So he can count on Miz to go and throw out a really long promo, or Randy Orton to just speak really slowly and repetitively for 5 or 10 minutes and go, brilliant, you've got me from one ad to another ad. I'm going to put the belt on you in a few months for that. Cheers. But I don't think they necessarily do that in NXT. And I think the rationale is you come to NXT, you develop a character, and then when you go out to the main roster, we'll show you how to exhaust that character over 15 minutes. But it just doesn't seem to work like that because, again, like I said before, character work is done in the ring. It's not done on the mic in NXT so much. So it just doesn't translate very well. You can imagine sort of Vince McMahon walking into Ricochet and going, hey, kid, so what's your shtick? And he goes, well, I'm a pretty fantastic wrestler and I can rotate 720 degrees in the air. And Vince is thinking to himself, well, that's 4 seconds of TV. I can do nothing with that. Like, it's useless to him. So he ends up just kind of getting stuck in that sort of second hour of doom just before the last women's tag match and disappears.
Getting blown over by Lesnar in a pay-per-view match. I think it's interesting what you're saying there, and I sort of agree and disagree. So I don't know if that means I agree or disagree, but in theory, WWE is, when you look at it on the surface, failing to convert that NXT talent. So people like Undisputed Era and Gargano and Ciampa, who've led the brand for a long time, have stayed down there in NXT. You think about Ricochet, who I think Meltzer said, you'd have to do an amazing job to mess up Ricochet. Well, then Vince McMahon has done an amazing job. Aleister Black, where is he? Keith Lee would be another good example, who was at the absolute pinnacle, maybe in all of WWE when he had the double titles. Since then, where is he? I know there's a bit of an injury, but he hasn't been done a good job on the main roster. Almas is off somewhere with the Flares. He was obviously fantastic in NXT. And then Finn Balor's gone back down to NXT. So you rattle all those off and you think, yeah, actually WWE is doing has an awful track record here of converting talent to the main roster. But then you sort of pull back and think, well, hold on a second. Until recently, the champions were McIntyre and Reigns, both from NXT. You've got the Shield that came through, which I know is a long time ago, but even if you're looking at SmackDown now, you've got Reigns and Rollins, Owens, Zayn, Big E, Cesaro, Bryan, Corbin. Is Riddle still on next? I think he's on Raw now, but you've still got lots and lots of talent that are coming through, the Wyatts, and making it big on the big roster, on the main roster. But equally, it's a sort of dichotomy because you've got all those coming through, but then you're also seeing all this talent, arguably Ricochet and Lee, the biggest of it, that's being wasted. So I don't know. What do you think is behind that? Do you think that's something to do with AEW, or is there a bottleneck, or is it just the fact that some people can translate to the main roster and some can't, and Vince just does the same with everyone, and that means some fall by the wayside?
I reckon there is almost too much talent. There's only so many people that can hold belts at any given time in any given show. If you have 5 wrestling matches, it has to be winners and losers. So of course you take the very cream of the crop and they will survive. But for those to be very, very successful, they usually have to trounce a fair few. So Rollins, Reigns, you keep them strong, but that means they've got to blast for Apollo Crews. They've got to smash through Matt Riddle until very recently. They were Breezango, they have to get hammered on a weekly basis because in order to keep those very few strong, and a fair few have to kind of bite the bullet. And I think that you kind of only have a fair few favourites that kind of maintain. And I think Vince isn't really that invested in anybody else. So he's happy to use NXT almost as like, feed the beast, feed the Lesnars, feed the Reigns, feed Rollins, feed McIntyre, who is an outlier. And I reckon he's an outlier because he is huge. He's just a massive man. And hence why he gets over and passes to everybody else. because a lot of the guys you mentioned prior to that are from a very early generation of NXT. You're talking 2016, 2017, when you start thinking about sort of Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens and those ilk. But once you get past 2017, pretty much most of the call-ups, barring McIntyre, have been a disaster. So when you had less talent coming through NXT, it was okay to kind of feed them up into the main roster over time and allow them to get bigger and to be successful. But now they're coming up at a slightly faster rate. There's more of them. And there's more coming up than there are leaving. It's not as if the wrestling lifespan is only 3 or 4 years long. Flair was on television the other day. I can't believe it. Flair's still knocking about. It's a global pandemic. Let him stay at home.
Charlotte told him to go home, so that's fair, isn't it?
There's only so much. You've got so much talent coming through and not enough talent coming out. So you will end up with a bit of a bottleneck. And yeah, I don't think Vince is really too fussed about who comes from the team. I reckon he doesn't even watch the product.
Ultimately, Vince doesn't know what to do with his talent, which means that some succeed and some don't. And not much of it is to do with Vince being actively involved in it. It's more like incidental than deliberate.
Absolutely.
And that's got more prevalent recently and I think I agree with you, in the last 18 months or so, the call-ups have just been, in the last 18 months or so, you'd probably say, well, before the pandemic, NXT in the year before was as good as it had ever been. And the call-ups have actually been the worst in terms of impact they've ever been. So that sort of plays onto
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's still a bit of I think I don't know who decides what in back office at WWE, but I think that's probably a failing on the rationale that what should happen in NXT is that you should rise to the top of the card, and once you're at the top of the card, you should sort of go up. So Aleister Black and Almas have to go up because they've won the big belts. What else you sort of do with them? But really, because of what NXT should do, the type of wrestlers that should go up are those with the biggest, boldest characters. Because you can sort out wrestling later on that night. You can always go back to the performance center and practice. But Cameron Grimes, in my opinion, he's ready to go up straight away. His gimmick now is absolutely quality. And it's probably best that before he does all of the $1 Million Man vignettes in NXT, send them up now as a millionaire hillbilly, and then just do it all up there for like a year and a half. He'll get over without a shadow of a doubt. He'd be a great US champion. He can still wrestle. He can still go. His double stomp finisher gets over really, really quickly. Put him up there now. Doesn't need to have won anything in NXT to be a success. Elias is another success, I would argue, from NXT to WWE. He gets more screen time than most. Not because he can wrestle or because he's won any belts in NXT, because he can play the guitar, he can go out there for 15 minutes and sing songs. And Raw is a variety show. It's not a pure wrestling show. It's like this whole carnival of all these experiences, which makes it such sports entertainment. And the likes of Elias and Cameron Grimes serve much greater purpose on the main roster than they do in NXT, because they've got the characters to go and fill time. And to get behind the crowds. Another success from NXT to, I forgot their names, it's terrible. Another success from NXT to the main roster is Enzo Amore and Big Cass, because they've got a great catchphrase. It's not because they're particularly great wrestlers. So I think rather than thinking about it as NXT you get to the top of NXT and you go up, I think you go, well, who are the best sort of boldest characters you can cultivate in NXT and then get them up as soon as possible. And I think the failing really is on NXT to sort of recognize their role in the developmental process, as opposed to it really being Vince being a failure. I think he can only work with what he's got. And that the people that have been called up aren't strictly what he wants or what he needs.
Some really interesting points, actually. Just a couple of things that I wanted to kind of fire back at you. Probably a couple of extenuating circumstances are Andrade and Aleister Black. Andrade failed a couple of wellness policy checks, didn't he? So that's probably put paid to a lot of his pushes in recent times. And Aleister Black is more than likely caught up with all the Selena stuff, right? We've seen with what marital what marital couples and how they get treated when Rusev left for AEW. Look how Lana's been treated in recent times. But just wanted to get your thoughts on Damien Priest. I think it looked an absolute monster in NXT, booked really strong. Obviously, he's absolutely massive, right? He's like 6'7" or something. So he's classic Vince. And he's teaming up with Bad Bunny.
Yeah. But the thing is, though, like, it's a way when I reckon that in Vince's mind, that's him. That's great. Like, the Bad Bunny spot's a great spot. It's gonna be in WrestleMania without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, top merch seller, isn't he? In the last month for WWE.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Damien Priest is someone who wasn't strictly at the top of the NXT card, but again does for the top. It's got a rock star element about him that you can get behind. Is again an absolute unit. He's massive. So he actually ticks a lot of Vince McMahon's boxes. I think there's a lot of talk of trying to crack the Latin American market as well with WWE at the main roster level. So he's a Spanish speaking. I'm not exactly sure where he's from. If I'm honest
Australia.
with you, but sorry,
Australia.
Oh, really? I did not know that.
You talk about Damien Priest?
Yeah.
He's Adelaide, I think.
He's definitely Spanish speaking, and definitely has all the tools that Vince needs out of a big guy. He's got a big character, maybe not the largest, but Spanish speaking in the unit. I think that ticks 2 out of 3 boxes. I think that will do for Vince going into this WrestleMania, and I think his spot is a good one. I think Aleister Black as a challenge. I think even before the issues with Zelina Vega, they had a character who was dark and sullen and didn't speak very much. So Vince put him in a cupboard because he can't fill time. So, you know what I mean? Just sitting here and be quiet. And he didn't go out there and do the things that made him really, really good. Andrade had a fairly decent run before things started going left, but really didn't pull up any trees before things started going wrong with wellness policies and things of that ilk. So I still think the vast majority of those call-ups, the top of the NXT card to main roster call-ups have for the last 2 years probably been a failure, barring Drew McIntyre as an outlier. And anybody else who's gone up, who has been successful, probably hasn't been at the very top of the card. They've been big and bold characters.
Even McIntyre, actually, I suppose the recent run is fresh in our minds, but it took him a long time to actually get to that champion position. He spent a long time messing around with Ziggler, being fed to the Shield. So even someone who is an outlier, who's a big strapping guy, looks like he's a Vince McMahon type person, who has also been in the company before and we know Vince likes, it still took him all this time since his call-up, which, I mean, I think he was winning NXT titles in 16, 17 maybe. So it's still taking him a long time after that injury to get to where he is now. So even as an outlier, he's probably an inlier.
I think that's fair.
Just wanted to get your thoughts on a couple of other things before we wrap up, Big Bryce. What were your thoughts on the Wrestling Capital Center, as it's called now, the slightly different take on pandemic times setup compared to the Thunderdome?
I think it's cool. I think it's nice that it's different. I think you put all your shows in the Thunderdome in that format, they all start to look pretty samey. And it is clear that NXT is different. It's not Raw and it's not SmackDown. And I think the CWC gives it a slightly different feel. And I think that's really strong. And I like I like sort of the metal railings. It makes it seem darker and a bit more like what Raw Underground could have been, hopefully. But never mind. You move on from those sort of errors. But yeah, it feels a bit grittier and it feels more in keeping with what NXT is. It's darker, it's stiffer, and I think the CWC gives it that sort of feel. Sorry.
And going forward, what do you think the future holds for NXT and how they can sort of potentially turn around the last couple of years that we've been sort of discussing today?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question. I think it's kind of safe to say that sort of, for me anyways, that late 2017 to sort of early 2019 is really a great era, for want of a better word, of NXT. And it's safe to say we're not really at the same sort of heights now. And that is because they've lost some really top talent. And I reckon it's also exposed by the 2-hour time slot on television, that you kind of expose a bit more of sort of the thinness of the roster as well. And they've lost some really, really good talent that have completely left the company now. I think AOP were awesome in NXT.
Yeah.
Sanity were a great faction. They've not necessarily lost them, but they've lost Eric Young, but they've kind of got the rest of them dotted around the world, I suppose. But I reckon in order for NXT to kind of really shine again and prosper, I reckon it needs to really be considered as a legitimate third brand and really kind of been seen on a par with Raw and SmackDown, a slightly different version of what they do, slightly different style, but it should really be kind of raised up and seen as part of that same sort of canon. And I think that's tough because it's called NXT. And what I'm kind of saying is NXT needs to be not next, but now, which isn't really what the presentation is. But I could be arguing for a whole rebrand, but I definitely think that NXT needs to be pushed up and seen as a proper brand. And that way you can move talent around a bit more easily. So it's easy to pick up a Kevin Owens, or if he's not doing anything, or pick up an Aleister Black or Ricochet, and really flesh out the quality of that roster. And accepts that it's not a developmental program anymore, it's a wrestling show. And then you kind of create a whole new NXT of burgeoning talent where you kind of learn how to do WWE style. I suppose they've already hoovered up a fair few wrestling promotions in the last few years, but Evolve kind of really rings true, I think, of that. Could really be what NXT ought to be as a way to sort of bring new talent and cultivate new characters and move them up to different rosters. And NXT becomes a third brand that's distinct, different, but in the WWE canon. Because even sometimes when you listen to commentators, you're not too sure if NXT is part of WWE or is it underneath WWE? Is it a separate company? Is it part of the company? You're not sure. Charlotte Flair's here, that's cool, but now she's gone again. All right, Edge is here, but he's not gonna choose Balor, is he? So I don't know. I think moving them up, really being seen on a par with those two shows, but different, and bringing up Evolve as a new developmental brand could be the way to allow the team to move forward, but also recollect some of the talent that's lost and build a really, really strong roster in its own right.
So you're talking about how it's positioned, really. So at the moment, it's positioned as you start off here, then you go somewhere else.
Yeah.
You get called up, you get lost in the shuffle. Well, you've been called up, you can't. Balor might go back down, but not many of you are. But actually, if you position NXT, and it does have 2 hours, doesn't it? The same as SmackDown. If you position NXT as there are 3 shows on SmackDown, you might get some decent wrestling and stuff at the moment. Raw, you're probably going to get some long promos and The Fiend on fire and Alexa Bliss doing some stuff. And on NXT, you're going to see cleaner, crisper, more efficient wrestling and effective potentially, but with less character-driven, overarching storylines. And then actually what you're doing is giving NXT a chance to thrive, but also pulling back in those wrestlers like Black and Ricochet that are struggling. So you're sort of saying position it on a par and let it do its thing, which actually is how Vince, that's why Bad Bunny is around, because Vince wants people to consume wrestling in different ways, and he knows people will hit up Bad Bunny on the internet or YouTube or whatever, and that's their way in. He knows that people might like the Undertaker gimmick and watch a gimmick match with the Undertaker in. He knows that some people tune in only for pay-per-views. Some people want to know what Wyatt's doing and get set fire. He knows that in the Middle East they like Goldberg and legends. So he's not really thinking about one fan's experience. He's thinking about all the fans that I can possibly attract in all the different ways, and I'll just segment up my stuff to appeal to all those different people. And Big Bryce won't like this, and Spoiler won't like this, and Andeve won't like this, but they might like this, this, and this. And so actually what you're sort of doing is appealing to Vince to just go all in on his philosophy and let NXT be another slice of that pie.
Let's not lose sight of the fact that all of the talent, such as the way that the wrestling landscape is these days globally, all of the talent is coming through the WWE training ranks anyway and going up in through the same channel. It's not like you've got loads of talent coming from different corners of the world applying different styles or trades. Like, it's all channeled into the same pot, right? So it's not going to make any difference. Your way is the way forward, Big Bryce.
Yeah, I think definitely positioning would be stronger. And also I think it makes for freshening up rosters really, really exciting. Drafts have become a bit meaningless and pointless because they kind of flip from one product that's pretty similar to another product that's really similar. But if you said, okay, I'd be quite interested to see what Dolph Ziggler did if he had to be in NXT for 6 months and have to really wrestle. I've never seen him do that. I haven't seen him do that in ages. I'd be really interested in that. Or I'd quite like to see what Tommaso Ciampa does when he has to go barb for barb with Roman Reigns on the mic. You get to see different aspects of these people. And yeah, you might discover something about a wrestler you didn't know before. I think that I read somewhere that Vince always saw the WWE in a similar way that some people follow sort of franchises in the NBA. You're not necessarily a Cleveland Cavaliers fan. You're a LeBron James fan. And if he's there, you follow him there. And if he goes to the Lakers, you go there. And you can do that if you position all players as equally valuable, no matter where they're playing. The NBA is the franchise. WWE is the franchise. So wherever they're playing, you just follow who you really like. And I think that will get over pretty quickly.
If you swing by episode 8, where we had a wrestling journalist on, Tom Collier, he was advocating exactly that. Big Bryce, any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Man, this has been an absolute blast. I've really enjoyed it. Watch wrestling, watch all of it, enjoy all of it. There's a lot of it out there at the moment, to be fair. So, also get outside and get some fresh air and stuff as well. But it's quality and I'm enjoying it.
Just an hour a day, though. Thank you very much for giving up some time and coming on. It's been a pleasure.
No worries, it's an absolute pleasure. Take care, guys.
All right, Wrestling Rebooked, Section 3. It's time for Doc in Review, as ever. WWE Icons is a new TV show on the WWE Network. And doing the rounds is the Yokozuna documentary. Hour long, maybe a little bit more than that, on the rise and fall of the big man. Now, for me, Yokozuna was one of the sort of first memories of wrestling that I really had. He's one of those sort of mega stars, big stars in more ways than one, that stood out on the card as a wee kid. So this documentary definitely had sort of multiple levels of interest. What do you think, Andeve?
Interesting. What did you say? It was part of their new series. What's the series called?
Icons.
So they got Icons, they got Untold, 365, 24, Home Classics.
Yeah. That's before you get to like Table for Threes.
So loads and loads. So it's one thing WWE does is a fantastic documentary. I'm not sure why they keep having all these rebrands in the way that they sort of approach them, but I suppose it gets people to think, oh, there's a new series of documentaries, I'll watch them. I thought the Yokozuna documentary was very good. I'm watching it, so I remember him a little bit, but more from watching it sort of back in the following years than actually watching WrestleMania 9 and 10. Wasn't really following WWE at that time. I thought it was interesting for 3 reasons. Do you want to hear what they were?
Please.
Maybe no one else does, but you can. So I thought the first thing is it really put across to me how short his time at the top was. So, and for a while he was at the very top because he's main eventing WrestleMania 9. He's main eventing WrestleMania 10 and having 2 matches at WrestleMania 10. He's also winning the title from Hogan at King of the Ring 93 in between WrestleMania 9 and 10. So he's really, really on the top echelons of WWE at this time. And of course, he also wins the 1993 Royal Rumble. So you're talking about a guy right at the very top here, which I think, first of all, is interesting or important because you're talking about a top star. Alongside that, there's 2 sort of things that run with it. One is that he got there very quickly. I talk in the documentary, he's the second fastest newcomer at the time, I think, maybe still, to win the title, other than Flair. No one's got there as quick as him. And he was also at the time, at 26 years old, the youngest champion. So we're really talking about someone here who's at the top of their game and got there very quickly, which is the first thing I took away from the documentary.
I thought we were going to get everything else. We're going to do it bit by bit.
You want to keep going? Well, yeah, no, I'm going to the second, unless there's something you wanted to.
Well, I think it's worth noting at this stage that it's interesting. You jump straight to the sort of 93 run. Of course, he makes his debut in 92. And if you look at his family background and the guys that had come before him, who of course wrestled in the territory days, none of them had the impact that he did. Mm-hmm. But what Yoko did have was the power of a gimmick behind him. And that just happened to fit perfect for him at that time. So I think it's Sergeant Slaughter, isn't it, who seems to take credit for coming up with the Japanese gimmick for someone in a Samoan family.
Well, they didn't seem to mind, did they? Actually, on the documentary, there was no talk about it being. They were like, "Yeah, of course, it's a gimmick. It works fine."
Yeah, it draws. So who cares? And in actual fact, that comes to my next point, that in that early period, you see the way he draws heat because he's just doing 2 or 3 simple moves in the ring where he's crushing his opponents in ways you'd never see booked today. And the heat he draws from the crowd, you've got on the one hand the kids who are just sort of in shock of this monster just crushing people. And it looks so real. And secondly, the adults, there's a shot of a woman spitting at him as he walks out of the arena.
Yeah.
That's heat. Nash should be impressed.
Yeah, Kevin Nash wanted to book heat. Well, it does say in the documentary, Vince was looking for a big monster heel at the time, and he sort of found him. And also the legitimacy of it. So actually, we talked in our Elimination Chamber review about Kofi Kingston's move. Does that look legitimate? And the flow of the women's tag match. Well, he looked like a legitimate guy that could smash Hogan, Undertaker around Bret Hart, which obviously, especially Hogan and Taker, very few could. The second thing I thought was that this is very much a sort of the story of a tragedy. We're really talking about the story of a tragedy here because we're talking about someone who falls from a great height very quickly. I have to say, I didn't realize he was only 34 when he died. I would have whacked another 10 years on that. So you're talking about someone who at 26 is the youngest champion in the history of WWE. And he's got there quicker than anybody else, apart from arguably the greatest of all time. And in 8 years is dead. And 6 years is wrestling independence. So it's really, really a story of the tragedy. And you've talked there about his wrestling legacy, what's come before him, and how he broke that glass ceiling. And then you look at what's come after him in terms of his family, but he actually, and how much he paved the way for them. He actually wasn't around to see it. And the documentary really clear on how supportive he was of his family. He'd give them blank checks and help them all. And yet everything he did to pave the way for them, he then ended up not, Rikishi maybe and The Rock, I suppose, but not really seeing the full fruits of that labor because unfortunately, in 2002 or whenever it is, he's dead. 2000. Yeah. So that was the second thing I thought. It's a very tragic story.
There's no doubt about that. Just wanted to quickly, on a slight tangent, pick your brains on some of the booking around, like setting him up with Hogan and having Hogan interfere at WrestleMania 9 and how that may have had an impact on his run.
I think probably it had less of an impact on him and more of an impact on Hart. I think actually for Bret Hart, I think he's like, hold on, what's going on here? What's this about? Why is this happening? And I think for company guys like him, I think he would have been more critical of actually what happened with Hogan. For Yokozuna, new champion, young guy. You're going to be in the main event. You're going to lose to Hogan, but then you're going to beat Hogan. Well, fair enough. And they were trying to draw overseas because Hogan was sort of on his way out. And then he still gets his like I say, his rematch at King of the Ring 93, WrestleMania 10. He's still there. So I expect it probably didn't have too much of a negative. It was actually probably more of a rub to work with Hogan in that main event than it was the negative that the rest of the company would have seen. Yeah, that's fair. I think that the presentation is everything with him, isn't it? And actual fact, he was presented in not too dissimilar way as, say, a Goldberg is presented today. Yeah. 1 move, 2 move, 3 move, and that's the end of the match. Not sort of a glorified squash, but it just worked for him because he was such a presence, and his
perception to everyone else was so different to the rest of the roster. A couple of notes that I had from the documentary, and the first thing that jumped off for me, of course, and this is something that we've talked about at length on previous episodes, is how similar it was to the Dark Side of the Ring.
Yeah, that's true.
And I wonder if there was any, in putting this together, if there was an element of thinking about that, if that would come together. I know there's a new season coming of Dark Side of the Ring. But yeah, look, I agree with you. Like, it's such a tragedy. You know, his last PPV for the company was Survivor Series 96, which happened to be The Rock's first, which is staggering, really. And for years before that, he was in a tag with Owen Hart because he just couldn't move anymore.
That's right. Yeah, and you think Rikishi is elevated to sort of main event player end of 2000, and really, there's no reason Yokozuna couldn't have been in the company to be part of that. But
yeah,
not only has he left the company a long time before, but by the time Rikishi's doing that, he's dead. Yeah.
A couple of other notes from me from the documentary specifically was the impact that his death had on the locker room. Maybe we just kind of take it for granted because so many wrestlers have passed, but it just seemed absolutely huge that his passing had such an impact on top guys in the locker room. And that, I guess, is reflected in the star power in the documentary itself. I mean, we see Vince in it, for God's sake, Taker, Brett, Roman Reigns. They all are under interview talking about Yoko, and mostly talking about him in a positive way.
Yeah, it shows his impact, doesn't it? Because you've got the chairman, you've got in Vince McMahon, you've got the company guy in Undertaker, you've got the sort of ultimate wrestling geek in Bret Hart, and then of course you've got the legacy directly from Yokozuna, which is Roman Reigns as a relation. So yeah, I think that's definitely true, and it's also clear that this documentary is a new one. So the Goldberg one we looked at was lots of old footage. It felt like archived or cut across, and the same with the Paul Bearer, which they'd sort of remodeled and reframed. This Vince looks his current age. Undertaker was outside of his gimmick delivering it. So that shows you a lot about the legacy and impact Yokozuna had. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the sort of presentation from a WWE standpoint, where they're talking about how they tried to look after him, tried to get his weight under control, set him onto various programs at various institutes, and ultimately failing because he just didn't want to take part.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I thought this was a positive. You never know with WWE because they're sort of telling you what they want you to think or what you should think or what you can't think. But it's quite clear in the documentary from Pritchard and people that they're trying to help Yokozuna. And in the last, it's sort of a home video footage of him wrestling on the independent circuit. He looks absolutely terrible, absolutely massive, and not in good condition at all. Not because of his size, but because of his weight. And the documentary makes it very clear that WWE was trying to help Yokozuna, which you don't see more recently with the firings and stuff like that.
Yeah, he didn't look too bad on the Big Breakfast, though, did he?
I actually used to watch the Big Breakfast as well, but I don't remember although he was lying down, I don't remember his appearance.
Everyone lied down on that bed, though, didn't they? There was no one's. I mean, there are conflicting reports, aren't there, that the help that WWE offered was slightly futile, and that a lot of the reports are suggesting that, he wasn't actually... what am I trying to say here? They weren't actively trying to get him to take part in the program. They were just sort of ticking boxes, as it were. They weren't checking on him as often as they were reporting, and they just left it to one person to sit and watch him. So it's difficult to know what to believe so many years later.
Yeah, I mean, I guess WWE is only going to present it one way, and especially if Vince is so involved. He's on the documentary. What I would say is that it looked like the problems were Yokozuna created. It wasn't as though WWE, again, this might be a totally misrepresentation, but it doesn't look WWE was pushing him and asking him more and more. It looks like it was the problems were of his own creation, and even some of his colleagues. I actually think, speaking of his colleagues that say that, interesting that BSK feature quite a lot on there in terms of the Godfather and the Undertaker, and that's a sort of faction that kicks around with the new generation alongside the Clique, but hasn't been talked about anywhere near as much. And yet, here's a documentary about Yokozuna and his impact, followed by The Rock and Reigns and how he trailblazed for them. You've got Godfather, you've got Undertaker, you've got all those people backstage there heavily involved in this documentary, which I thought was interesting.
Savio Vega as well. I think when I look at one of my main takeaways from this is actually when you look at the lineage of that family and Yokozuna's place in history, that has got to be Yoko's impact is absolutely seismic. As in before him, you had Afa and Sika, the tag teams, and then you had Rikishi come in as a head shrinker, but all mid card at best. Yoko, as you pointed out at the top, massively elevated that status. And then you look at what's come after him. It's only The Rock, and now you see Roman Reigns, the Usos, of course Rikishi in early 2000 Attitude Era, who made it to the top as well. So in actual fact, he had a massive impact on the way the industry has gone for that family in the last 20 years.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Fair point. And of course, Reigns has had his twins as well. That's part of the reason he was off. So maybe it continues further. I think the final thing I thought, the sort of third thing I took away from it was WWE's presentation of big guys as monster heels, and something they still struggle with today. And we've just seen the Big Show cross the floor and go to AEW. In that it seems quite normal for WWE to have a monster heel that has a run at the top or at the top of the mid cards, wherever it is that they place within the overall show, where they're top of the card for a year, 18 months, doing a great job, and then they just disappear into nothing. And I thought they were going to do different with Strowman, but actually he's, considering how over he was, he's been a sort of missed opportunity. And so Yokozuna, while they got it right and they had captured that magic in the bottle for a year or so, afterwards it spiraled quite quickly. Maybe not WWE's fault, but they still have that issue today in terms of how do we book these super heavyweights so that they can be dominant, believable, but also engage with other talent. And they've never quite, even with Mark Henry, Big Show, and all his multiple heel turns, and even Strowman today, they've never quite managed to do it. And I don't think they quite managed to do it, given how short his tenure is with Yokozuna either.
Yeah, it's difficult to analyze, isn't it, across different eras? Sort of like comparing Ronaldo and George Best, isn't it? Like it's with Yoko though, like they literally just booked him squash matches all the time. Like he used to fight on TV and TV tapings, and it was just a squash. It was never anything more. And then I think his title run was it Cornette said like 280 days of a heel champion in that era was just absolutely unheard of, considering he's surrounded by Hogan, Brett,
Lex Luger trying his best.
Yeah, so it's tricky, isn't it? Like to draw the comparisons, but I guess Andre the Giant would be the nearest and probably best comparison to Yoko in that regard.
I suppose if we're thinking in terms of giants and big people like that, you're talking high company. If it's Andre the Giant, Yokozuna, Big Show, Strowman, that's a high level of company and an elite group to be part of.
Very much so, and he definitely is. And I guess my closing thought would be is that even for the casual wrestling fan, this Yokozuna documentary is worth a watch, because it just encapsulates multiple eras and almost a defining run at the top, albeit a very sad one, as you pointed out along the way.
Yeah, it's definitely a good documentary, especially with the people it takes in alongside him. I think that way, a bit like the matches we were talking about, they have to be a good match and they have to fit into something bigger. Well, the Yokozuna documentary is interesting in terms of what it talks about him, but also how it fits into a bigger picture. So that's why it's worth a watch.
Yeah, very, very much so. Wrap things up, shall we?
Yeah. So get on that documentary, get on that pay-per-view, and enjoy NXT TakeOver. Is that what we're saying?
I'll tell you what we're also saying. We're still waiting to hear from Ontario.
Yeah, exactly. Loads of downloads. Drop us a tweet.
Wrestling Rebooked. Until next time.
Time to tap out.
Wrestling Rebooked. Spoiler in ND. Putting wrestling into submission. Welcome to Wrestling Rebooked with Spoiler and Andeve, rewriting your favorite angles the way we want to believe. Putting wrestling into submission. Finally, that time has come. We used to rely on Meltzer, now we bang our own drum. Wrestling Rebooked. Spoiler in ND. Putting wrestling into submission. The Spot Monkey is here, shooting from the hip, back to break more, and ready to let rip. Spoiler is the host. Will his mic be ready to go? He loves a mat clinic, and we're ready to start the show. From Mania to Survivor Series, a wrestling podcast. Each match rebooked, fresh views are cast. Wrestling Rebooked. Spoiler in ND. Putting wrestling into submission. Our finger is on the pulse for all the latest news. What's going on with Vince? We don't really get his views. We love a doc and review, old school to new. I think it's time to tap out. Hit the music. We're through. Wrestling Rebooked. Spoiler in ND. Putting wrestling into submission.